He's a licensed psychologist and a board-certified analyst, doctoral level, BCBA-D, and has more than 35 years' experience working with children with developmental disabilities. I'd like to read the rest of the bio for you, but I don't want to cut into his time, so at this point, I'm going to introduce Dr. James Partington.
Larry, I'm glad you left me the time, because I'd much rather have the time to talk to you than have you hear about me. Yeah, got it?
Yeah.
Okay. A little sensory overload for a few of you for a few seconds there, huh? Okay, I think we're good to go? All right, wonderful. Well, it's hard to know where to start other than to say that I've been doing this a long time. I started working with children in 1972, children with disabilities, including children with autism. I've taught at several universities. I've worked with school systems. I've worked in private family homes, teaching people how to work with children with autism. And I will be the first to say that I don't have all the answers. And I'll tell you that anybody who comes to you and says they have all the answers for how to work with a child with an autism spectrum disorder, you should probably turn and run, okay? Because there's nobody possible who knows all of the things we need to know about how to help these children. However, what I am going to do today is talk with you about some very critical features about intervention services for children that really need to be considered to try to help the children using technology that we've known about for a number of years and some technology that's still rather new. The most important part for me in terms of working with children with a developmental delay like autism or autism spectrum disorder or Asperger's syndrome is to start by taking a look at our focus on things. When you start to look at what that word is, autism spectrum disorder, well, basically all of you are pretty well familiar with it, but the main point I'm trying to point out here to you today is not teach you the definition of the DSM-3. We don't need to worry about that. What we need to worry about is the issues of what resulted in this label being placed. And one was clearly the fact that we have an individual with some language delays. And I know there's differences between autism and Asperger's syndrome. They may have more language skills with the Asperger's syndrome than with an autism type of diagnosis. However, the key issue here is that if you don't have good functional communication skills, if you don't have a way to relate to others by talking, how are you going to develop your social interaction skills? But just because you can talk doesn't mean you have the social interaction skills. But if you don't have the ability to talk and communicate, it's certainly going to limit your social interaction skills. And if in fact you don't fill your world with things that you can do by socially interacting with others and enjoying your interactions with them, what are you going to do? Well, you're not going to sit around and do nothing, you're going to do something. And so there may be some tendencies to engage in some behaviors that some people might say, well, that's really atypical. Okay. Well, yes, it may be atypical, but when you stop to consider that if you don't have language as a vehicle for being able to interact with others, you're probably going to find some other ways of entertaining yourselves, and it may end up being a little bit odd to other people. Stephen Shore and I talk quite a bit these days, and what's interesting is I changed some of they had on the bottom, I used to say restricted range of interest. Well, now it's, or highly focused. So Stephen's affected me quite a bit in terms of, it depends on how you want to word this. And I think it's very important that we word things carefully. But as I always put when I talk to an audience, the main issue for working with any individual, and I don't care who they are, if they're typically developing, if there's atypical development, you want a child to have a happy life. You want them to enjoy themselves, not just in the future, but now. And the other part is what we want to do for any child is we want to give them as many skills as possible to go out in the world and be able to use them to take advantage of all the opportunities that are there for us. And so that's always my main issue. I want children to enjoy themselves. I want them to enjoy working with me or my staff. I want them to enjoy the process of learning. And I want them to learn just as fast as they can, because by definition, these children are behind, and we need to help them get caught up if we can. And if we can't help them get caught up, we still want them to leave with as many skills as possible so that what's happening is they have access to those broader range of activities. So the goal for me is not just about teaching a child skills, but rather it's about teaching them skills that allow them to sort out how the world's coming at them, such that they can make sense of it and can actually participate in the world. I want them to be able to learn not just from highly trained instructors who have been taught how to teach real specific skills, but also I want them to learn from their interactions with their peers, from their neighbors, from their aunts and uncles, people who come over and visit, anybody that they interact with who cares about that individual and wants to show them some things. I want the child to be able to learn from that. It's not just about teaching them the answer. It's not just about saying, what's your name? And they say, Jim. And I say, oh, that's good, that's right. Somebody's going to come along and say, hey, buddy, who are you? Or I don't know you. Can you tell me who you are? Those are all the same ways of trying to ask, what's your name? And if we don't teach a child how to understand that, how to respond to those situations, we're really leaving them with a hole just by teaching them to say, what's your name? And they say, Jim. So we got to teach a generalized set of skills that allow them to learn from their everyday interactions with others. I throw up a little bit of research here for you, not that I'm going to go over it in great detail, but we do know from the research that if you provide early intensive behavioral intervention, many children will actually do quite well in terms of being able to make it to regular education. However, the data are very clear that more than half the children, under the best of circumstances, still are going to require some special education type of services. So it's not the goal necessarily for me to make this all go away, although that's often what parents will tell me. We have to embrace some of these individual differences and say, how do we still help these individuals move along so that they can, again, have as many skills to make their life as enjoyable as possible. Lovas's study in '87 brought hope to a number of families who before had been told basically that if you get a diagnosis, you know, when you listen to Ron Kaufman, what they told his parents, well, that is what people were being told. You know, they're never going to do this, they're never going to do that. Well, our methodology has improved to the point where we can help some individuals, but there's some factors that are built into it. The study by Lovas in '87 was replicated by Solos and Gropner out of the WEEP project out of Wisconsin. And so I just want to give you those references in case you're interested. I'm going to flash on and move because I have a half an hour and I don't want to talk about research too much. What I want to do is talk about the major issues that need to be considered in putting together a program for a child. One, you have to identify and track the skills and the skills deficits. It's one thing to say, we're going to start working with this child and we're going to teach them, but what are you going to teach them? That's extremely crucial. And having worked in special education environments for many years, I know that's one of the biggest fundamental errors that I come across when I see programming for children, is that they often don't have an adequate IEP that addresses the specific needs of each individual child. And so we're going to talk about that more extensively in a few minutes. Another thing we're going to talk about here is the active engagement by a motivated learner. I think when you start listening to Stephen Shore, you listen to Ron Kaufman, what are they telling you? Well, they're telling you that yes, you learn from those who you enjoy interacting with. Motivation. We have to make sure that the children want to run to us, not run from us when we're trying to work with them. And that's where sometimes when you start looking at some of the programming that people have done and are still doing today sometimes, it's more of an avoidance type of an issue. They do it, the kids do something to get over with the session so they can leave the person. Well, that's ridiculous. If you want a child who has language delays and social interaction delays to develop the social skills, there better be a reason for them to want to come back to you, okay? And that is because you make their life better than what they can get on their own for free without you. So that's my main concept of motivation, is you want the kids to do things for you because it improves things for them. It makes their life better. They enjoy it, so they naturally want to be with you. But in order to learn any skills, one of the things that we have to do is make sure we get many acquisition trials. It's not just enough to try a skill once and then move on. We've got to do these over and over and over again. We've got to practice, and we've got to practice in methods that are going to result in the most effective teaching possible. We also want to make sure that we're doing this in varied learning environments. You don't just do things at a table and hope like heck that they're going to use it out in the community or some other place away from where they learned it. So we got to make sure that we're teaching across all environments. We need to make sure that we're not just teaching 10 or 20 trials of a certain type of response in a row. If I were to ask, for instance, what is it? And you say glass. And I say, what is it? And you say pen. And then I switch and I say, what color is it? And you say tie. That's a function of bad teaching. because they've learned the sequence. They don't have to listen to what you're asking anymore until you switch it. And then all of a sudden you say, no, it's blue. And then all of a sudden you say, what color is it? And they go, black. And they say, what do you do with it? And they say, clear, I guess. Because again, they're now on colors until you switch over to the function of things. So we want to make sure that we're mixing it up just like life comes at us. It's never 20 questions in a row on the same topic. It's always switching. We got to do the same for the children because that's how they're going to use the skills. And on top of that, we want parent participation. I have many parents that come to me just scared to death to work with their child because they're afraid they're going to screw it up. And I said, well, listen, you're going to be bathing them, feeding them, dressing them anyhow. You may as well learn how to use those times to teach them skills that the child can use today and can use tomorrow so you can become a very, very good teacher. Many parents say, I want to learn to do this because I don't trust anybody else to do this right, okay? And so again, parent participation is absolutely crucial. The issue of not having enough time, I always say you're doing it anyhow. You're interacting with them. You may as well make the most of it while you're there, changing them, dressing them, feeding them. Teach them while you're there. But we need to know what to teach. They need to know what they need to learn and what will be useful for them today. That's one of the key issues. A lot of times people are teaching skills to children because they're going to need it later on. Well, there's a whole lot of skills that the children, by definition, often need to learn right now that they could use today. So rather than teach them for tomorrow, let's teach them what they can use today. Because rather than having to try to go around using organically grown raisins, which is a politically correct thing for what they used to call M&Ms, right? Is we don't want to have to do that. What do we want to do? We want them to become trapped by the natural interactions, the reinforcers that come from using the skills, not from some type of other reinforcers that we have to kind of supply. We may need to use something to motivate them to get them going, but we certainly want them to be doing the skill because it works for them in their daily life. And we need to track the skills. And I've developed this assessment called the ABLES-R, the Assessment of Basic Language and Learning Skills. Many of you have been stopping by my booth and seeing some and talking with me about it, and I can show you the normative data in a little more detail. But the bottom line, it's a criterion-referenced assessment that reviews 544 skills from 25 areas. The assessment of basic language and learning skills is really critical because these are the skills you need to learn to be able to learn from your everyday interactions. There's also some academics, some self-help, and some motoric skills in there too. But the basic language skills are very, very critical. Now what you see here in front of you is one page of 3 pages of grids. There it goes, now my pointer's working. And so this is receptive language skills, for instance, and there's 57 skills. Each one going across represents a different skill, and then the amount filled in represents the amount of the skill as measured by the criteria in the assessment. But it measures things like cooperation, your ability to go along with things, visual performance skills like being able to match things that go together, puzzles, Piagetian seriation text, receptive language, motor imitation, vocal imitation, the ability to ask for things, request things, to be able to label things that you see, like saying that's a microphone, that's a glass, that's a chair, and the ability to talk about things in their absence. Call that introverbals. That's a verbal behavior term that you don't really need to worry about so much. Just know that it's talking about things in their absence. What did you do today? Who did you go lunch with? What did you have for lunch? What happened out on the playground today? The things that parents want their children to be able to come home and give meaningful answers to when they ask, what did you do at school today? Not just, I played with Michael. Well, Michael wasn't there today, but you don't know that, okay? But he learned that if he says he played with Michael, everything's okay, and you'll let him go on and play with his iPad or something. So it has to be, how do we teach them to actually talk about their experiences? Well, we start with the ABLES. We go through a lot of different issues. This is a sample item. This is labeling objects, common 3D items. So if you ask a child, what is it? Can they label things like shoes and cups and shirts and dogs and pants and so forth? If they could label at least 5 things, they get a score of 1. If they could label 10, they get a score of 2. If they could label at least 50, they get a score of 3. If they could label 100, including novel examples, they'd get all the way across a score of 4. What this translates into is a grid system where we fill in what the child's skills are. So here you can see that the child has some receptive language skills, some imitation, some vocal imitation skills, a little bit in the requesting, but it's all pretty heavily prompted, a little bit of the labeling. They're fairly cooperative. And so we're measuring that in this grid. We are also measuring things like syntax and grammar, play skills, social skills, group participation, and so on. Also, there's some academic skills, some math and reading. Over here, there's some writing and spelling. There's some self-help skills like dressing and toileting, and so forth, and eating, and then you got your motor skills, your gross and fine. This first one that I showed you is of a little boy that I started working with when he was 3 years, 5 months of age. We started working with him, and what we'll do is we update the assessment as we're working. We say, okay, now these learn the skills in green. We fill in the green, which gives us our targets to work on. These skills are put in order from simplest to more complex, so that you try to start teaching the easier skills before you start trying to teach the harder skills, with the exception of these here up on top, which are spontaneous use of the skills. But you'll see here that the child all of a sudden is picking up more skills, and we did our second assessment, so this is about 10 months into intervention, and we've measured him twice since we started, and he's making some pretty good progress on his receptive language skills, his imitation, his vocal imitation, even his requesting, his labeling, and his talking about things in their absence. And then we come back and we target later. We say, okay, now here he is after about 2 years of interventions, and now he's filling in all the scores. But it still leaves us some targets that we need to work on, because when you start to look at what a typical child will do, a typically developing 4-year-old child, these are what the data often look like. It's totally filled up. So when we're looking at a child who has skills like this, say, well, that's pretty good. Yes, but you see, this child here is not asking for information. My pointer's not working very well. Anyhow, the fourth bar coming from the right-hand side over, you'll see some white along the side there. Can't please go. It's not going to go for me. I'm stuck. Anyhow, it says he's not able to ask for information outside of a training situation. He can't ask who, when, how, or so forth, where this is something that a typical 4-year-old child is already doing before they get to kindergarten. Their social skills are very, very good. They're even learning some basic academics. Their motor skills, their self-help skills are good. That's a typical 4-year-old child. This is a chart for a typical 27-month-old child. They understand a lot of what you're saying to them. They can follow along with your directions. They can ask for things. In fact, many times by the time they're a little over 2, they're asking for stuff a whole lot and bugging people, right? They say, I wish they wouldn't talk so much. I said, don't say that. We work too hard to get children to be able to do that. But the idea is, by definition, the children we're working with are behind. The red line down below indicates that there's a slower rate of acquisition of skills by the time child's age 3 versus typical development. And if we don't do anything to change the course of skill acquisition, the rate, they're going to get further and further behind. So what we're trying to do by early intervention, or even intervention later, doesn't matter when you start, is to try to see if we can get this rate of acquisition of skills going up as quickly as possible. The problem is that, like at age 3, people will often try to work for skills that a child should have by the age of 4. But no, it can't be. What?
You have 10 minutes. I'm watching.
Oh, you're watching. Okay, we'll go. Okay, great. Okay, but we need to teach the skills they need right now. So what we got to do then is we got to go in, and I'm just going to quickly go through here, and we target what they can and can't do. And we work on those specific skills. We don't just teach skills, we teach skills the child needs to learn right now, this child as opposed to other children. Why work for us? Because again, it's easy to be successful with us, they enjoy us. Why does the child like his instructor? If not, you got a major problem, okay? Now the area that I'm speaking about today is mainly about language, and the issue is, how do you get these kids to develop functional communication skills? The problem with our way of thinking of expressive and receptive responses is the fact that there are many different types of expressive responses. There are abilities to ask for things, to label things, to be able to repeat the words that others are saying, and then the ability to talk about things in their absence. So what I've done here is I've tried to show you, my pointer is there it goes. You can ask for things, and this is where we'll often teach the children start asking for things, or we call it mand training, requesting, because this shows them when they want something, they can use some words to get something they want. That's very, very powerful. We also want them to be able to label things they see. We want them to repeat words. We want them to answer questions about like things you can read, a book perhaps. But you'll notice that the only one of these types of 4 responses, these are all different skills. It's the same word, but it's different skills, and all these skills have to be taught. The only one that gets them the specific item that they're asking for is the requesting or the mand. The rest of them are maintained by social reinforcement. But if a child were to look out the window and see something like that, it's raining out there, okay, and they go, rain. And then all of a sudden somebody comes up to them and say, you're right, it's raining. Social reinforcement, a little bit of praise, right? Then what happens? They say, well, what do we wear when it rains? What do we use to hold over our head to keep when it rains? What happens to our clothes when we go out in the rain? All of a sudden now the kid who noticed the rain, and you're supposed to be praising them and reinforcing them for spontaneously labeling something, now realizes next time they notice something about their environment, they should just be quiet, because you're going to come right over and turn it into a work session, okay? So we really have to think about the functions of what happens when we interact with children. Okay, now, okay, pretty fast here. This is me working with a little girl. And I'm teaching her to use some sign language. I'm going to talk over it for a little bit. She's not learned to be able to ask for things when she's hungry. So I found she had had some pizza her dad was preparing. And now what I'm going to do is teach her to do this, to give her some pizza from me. Now, I didn't steal her pizza from her. I had it from the beginning. Okay, so I'm making it better for her. And what I'm doing is giving her a small amount, so she has to keep doing this over and over again until she can start to let me know when she's hungry, she wants something to eat. We practice. And I'm using my prompts and fading my prompts as fast as I can. All right. And so slowly over time she learns how to do it. Now the important parts that I want to point out here is that you got to have the child paying attention to what you're doing. And I see so many times people working with children, the children are unmotivated, they're not paying attention to what you're saying, they give a half response and somebody comes in and helps them do it right, and then they get some reinforcer and they say, well, they're not learning. Well, why aren't they learning? They never paid attention. They were never required to give their best effort. Nobody was actually shaping their skills as they went along. So we need to make sure that they're paying attention to what we're showing, they're focused on it. This little boy was not doing well with learning how to communicate. And by doing so, what we end up getting is we're able to actually get him to start learning the signs for open so he can get access to things that he wants. He didn't learn to control his vocal musculature, but we couldn't even teach him to do any imitation skills until we really had him focused. But now we've got him motivated because he likes to smell these things, and here he is in a different environment now. He wants to smell these little tubes that my staff put some nice little scents in. And here he goes. So now all of a sudden, here we got a little boy that can do that. I'm going to skip through a couple of these here because they're probably the most important things I want to show you, and I've got a few minutes there. 5. What words are you going to teach a child? They don't have many words. Well, I have people coming in trying to teach kids giraffe and zebra. And I go, well, that's great. Why are you teaching giraffe and zebra? Well, because they need to learn some animals. Well, great. Do they know their backpack? Do they know a chair? You tell them to go line up at the door. Do they know what the door is? You tell them to sit at the table by the window. Do they know what the table is? Do they know what the window is? Can they identify their own backpack? Can they label shoes? Can they ask for those things? If not, why are we working about giraffes and zebras? You know, unless they really have a liking for giraffes and zebras, or they've got a zoo in their backyard with a giraffe and zebra sticking their head over the fence, it's probably not very functional for them. It's probably not going to be used today. Here's another skill that you need to work on. This is being able to describe things. Here's a little boy who has got a lot of language, but yet when you ask him to describe something, he can't do it. You'll see.
A woman, that's right. Can you tell me 4 things about a woman?
In the line.
She put what? Oh, she put in, or she's holding a cup. White cup, that's right. That is a woman. Talk about the woman. So you said she's holding a white cup, and then? She's pouring.
Good, he got one on his own, okay?
The woman.
You got it. When asked, you know, how does she feel? Happy. Okay, what's she wearing? Purple shirt. He could answer those questions, but he couldn't tell you without having somebody ask specific questions. That's not good enough.
Hi.
Now this,
5 little monkeys jumping on the one dog and bumped his. Mama called the doctor and the doctor said, said, no more monkeys jumping on the bed. How many? 3. Not 3, 4. Good job. 4 little monkeys jumping on the bed. One fell and bumped his. Mama called the doctor and the doctor said.
now that does not look like a robot to me, okay? This is a little girl who they're teaching her some what we call intraverbal skills, talking about things. And again, this is one of the areas of emphasis. I got about 2 minutes, right? 1 minute, okay. Well, what we need to do is get kids to talk about what they're going to do before they do them. When we're taking kids out who have some language skills, talk about what you're going to see in the park, what's going to be there. When you're there, you want to get them to talk about what they're doing while they're there, so when you get back, you can get them to go over and talk about what they did. How do kids learn to talk about what their experiences? You have to get them talking. You don't talk to them, you get them to talk to you. And I'm going to have to skip through a bunch here. I want to get to these critical points. Prioritized objectives. You need a good assessment to figure out what skills they have and don't have. You focus on the basic skills that are going to allow them to learn. When you start working on academics and those kind of things, although it may seem great, if they don't have the language to support it later on, you're going to run into problems with reading comprehension and all kinds of other issues. So it's really important that we get the language to at least that of a kindergarten age level child before we start expanding out into all these different areas. But we got to work on social interaction, we got to get them paying attention to us, it's joint attention, and we need to make sure that whatever we pick for them to work on is going to be useful for them today. Teach the language skills that are going to help them. And again, last but not least, where should teaching occur? Teaching needs to occur everywhere. It occurs in the bathroom, it occurs at the dinner table, it occurs while you're waiting in line at the grocery store. There are opportunities to teach if you know what to teach. And again, it comes back to the language. What particular language skills do you need to teach this child right now? You don't have to have an educational supply store for everything. You have your home. It can be an educational supply store if you know how to use them. Anyhow, thank you. Thank you, Teresa.